Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar here at Worksafe, Infringement Notices, a New Tool. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands we are all meeting on today, the First Nations people. Today, I am working beside the peaceful Moonee Ponds Creek. This is the lands of the Wurundjeri. I pay my respects to their spiritual connections with the land, the water, and the culture. And I ask that during today's webinar, you consider your own personal connection to the traditional custodians of the lands you are meeting on. So, good morning. My name is Kate Maheris. I am a Regional Director of Operations in Health and Safety here at Worksafe Victoria. And today I am lucky enough to be hosting this webinar. Today, you're going to be hearing about a new infringement scheme here in Victoria that will be beginning from the 31st of July. What this means for you and where you can go to get further information and support. Today is about giving you an overview of the new infringement scheme here in Victoria. Today, unfortunately, we won't be able to go into any hypotheticals or specific scenarios. We also won't be able to give you any specific legal advice. So let's jump into it and introduce you to the panel that I have here with me today. So firstly, we have Rob Kelly, who is the Director of Specialist Services in Health and Safety. Morning, Rob.
Good morning, Kate. Good to be here with you this morning.
Excellent. And we also have Natalie Wellard, who is Legislative Services Manager in Legal and Governance. Morning, Nat.
Morning, Kate. Happy to be here.
Excellent. All right, well, let's get straight into those questions. So, Rob, if I can start with you, can you take us back to the beginning? How did an infringement scheme come about?
Thanks, Kate. The Victorian government made an election commitment to introduce infringement notices for a range of offences under the OH&S Act and OH&S regulations. The stronger regulation for Victorian workplace is a priority for the Victorian government, and the introduction of the infringement notice scheme is an important step in ensuring the ongoing safety of Victorian workers. As a result of this, the OHS regs will be amended to prescribe certain offences where an infringement notice can be issued. The changes will also include specifying the fine or penalty amount that needs to be paid, but also gives Worksafe inspectors the ability now to issue infringement notices as an alternative to a prosecution. And importantly, the changes come into effect on the 31st of July this year, which is just over a week away.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Okay, now I'm going to come to you now. Are you able to talk to us about what is the purpose of an infringement scheme?
Sure. So infringement notices are a mechanism for inspectors to impose an immediate punishment for certain types of offences. And this sends a really clear and timely message that non-compliance there's a consequence for non-compliance. Infringement notices are a really common feature for regulatory schemes, and in fact, across Australia, many jurisdictions have already implemented infringement notices for workplace health and safety laws. So for Worksafe, infringement notice scheme is going to strengthen Worksafe's enforcement and compliance capability and act as an additional deterrent for non-compliance. But I have been speaking a lot about compliance and enforcement and punishment, but I think it's really important to know for duty holders out there that if you're doing the right thing, then you don't have anything to worry about. You don't have to change anything. You just keep doing what you're doing. An infringement notice is just an additional tool for compliance and enforcement. It doesn't change duty holders' obligations in any way.
Okay, well, that's really important to take note of. But Nat, you've mentioned there's a suite of enforcement tools that Worksafe have. So can you tell me a bit more about what other enforcement tools Worksafe has?
Yes, so Worksafe's compliance and enforcement policy is on our website, and that policy will be updated from the 31st of July to include infringement notices. But some of the compliance and enforcement tools that Worksafe have already is the provision of information and guidance, issuing improvement notices or prohibition notices or directions to remedy contraventions of OHS laws, prosecution through the courts, or seeking an injunction for non-compliance of an improvement notice, things like that.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Nat. Okay, Rob, coming back to you, getting into the detail a bit more, what is an actual infringement notice?
An infringement notice is basically a fine that is given by an inspector to a person who's committed an infringement offence that, as Nat was mentioning, is detailed in Schedule 20 of the OH&S regulations. It's basically a notice requiring a person to pay a prescribed penalty. The actual infringement notice itself will contain information about the alleged offence, how much is actually owed, but also ways to resolve the infringement, and that can include options for payment, requesting a review of the infringement notice itself, or applying or requesting that it be heard and determined by a court. The other piece of information that will be in there is the date by which you must pay the fine, and that will be at least 21 days from when the actual notice is served.
Okay, thank you, Rob. So Nat, again, getting into the detail, can you talk to us about what are the actual offences under this new infringement scheme?
So infringement offences are usually really straightforward in nature, where the offending conduct is clear and doesn't require an extensive investigation to determine if non-compliance has occurred. So the Worksafe infringement scheme will have 54 prescribed offences, and they can be found in Schedule 20 of the OHS regulations from the 31st of July. I won't go through all 54, but essentially some of the topics that are included are things like undertaking work without a required licence, registration, qualification, experience or supervision that's required by the regulations, using plant that is not licensed or registered as required, obligations around the removal of asbestos, or the obligations around keeping records, certain records.
Yeah, okay. So that is a reasonably sized list that we're all getting familiar with now. Am I right in that there are actually now 54 obligations we need to be aware of that could result in an infringement notice?
It's a really great question, and unfortunately it's not that simple. So some of the offences in those 54 offences relate to general offence provisions in the OHS Act. So, for example, Section 40, subsection 4 requires you to have a licence before you undertake certain activities. And the regulations contain those specific requirements to hold those licences. So, for example, there's obligations to hold licences to remove asbestos or to undertake high-risk work. So, in fact, there are actually 6 regulations that require you to have a licence to undertake certain activities. A breach of any of those 6 obligations would be a breach of Section 40 sub 4. So I know that's a lot of information to understand and to comprehend right now, but all of this information, so the full list of the 54 and all obligations that they relate to, can be found on our website from the 31st of July when the scheme goes live.
Oh, thanks, Nat. I am glad that that's going to be on the website. So Rob, can I come to you now? In regards to who is actually going to be fined under the new scheme, who gets issued the infringement notice?
Well, people who hold obligations under OH&S laws can be issued with an infringement notice if they breach certain offences. And that can be employers, self-employed persons, or individuals.
Okay, so individuals, does that mean employees could be fined under the scheme?
The short answer is yes. When you look at the infringement offences, they range across a whole range of obligations. And again, as I mentioned, for employers, self-employed persons, and persons or individuals. Infringement offences that are associated with individual obligations can include employees. And I'll give an example to follow on from what Nat was saying a little bit early on about licences. If an inspector is at a workplace and sees a person operating a piece of equipment or machinery that requires a high-risk work licence, and when they make inquiries, they determine they actually don't hold that licence, that person will be issued an infringement notice. That person could be an employee, so yes, they could.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. So, Nat, no doubt today on the webinar, we have a broad representation of Victorian employers, employees, HSRs from many different workplaces. I'm wondering, are there specific industries that these offences apply to from 31 July?
So the infringement offences will apply to all industries that Worksafe currently regulates. So that could be construction, agriculture, working with asbestos, mining quarries, major hazard facilities. So if you have an obligation and that obligation forms part of an infringement offence, then the infringement offence provisions can apply to you regardless of your industry.
Yeah, thanks, Nat. So, Rob, I'm coming back to you. Nat indicated something earlier around obligations. Does this infringement scheme introduce new obligations for employers that they'll be very familiar with their current obligations, but is this new?
No, it's not. Infringement notices are an additional tool available to an inspector for compliance and enforcement purposes. The infringement offences that are going to come into effect on the 31st of July are already obligations that people have. So if you're complying with them now, you won't need to change that. Ongoing compliance is important as well, but if you're, as Nat was saying a little bit earlier on, if you're complying with your obligations now, it doesn't increase or introduce any new obligations on you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So, Nat, coming back to you, what is the penalty for an infringement notice from the 31st of July?
So, as Rob said, the duties don't change, but now a breach of an infringement offence can be met with an immediate penalty. And that penalty is less than what could be given if you went to court. So, the infringement penalties are less than what the maximum penalty is that a court could impose. And the infringement penalty will vary depending on the offence, but effectively they could be up to $1,800 for a body corporate or $360 for an individual. So the prescribed penalty for each infringement offence can also be found in a table that will be included as Schedule 20 from the 31st of July.
Okay, so Nat, does this mean though that Worksafe won't be pursuing some offences through the court going forward?
No, so this is just an additional tool. All existing tools are still available, and prosecuting OHS breaches is still an important part of Worksafe's compliance and enforcement framework and will continue to be so. And I think, it's important to note as well that it's an additional tool, but it's a tool that can be used in conjunction with other tools. So, for example, if an inspector thinks it's appropriate, there could be an infringement notice issued, but also at the same time an improvement notice and definitely a provision of information and guidance.
Yeah, excellent. So, Rob, coming back to you, and you work closely with the inspectorate, we've heard that infringement notice joins that existing suite of compliance and enforcement tools. But I wonder, some people might be thinking, will this mean we don't issue improvement notices going forward?
No, as Nat was just saying there, is that this is an additional tool available to inspectors. So an inspector will still attend site, and where they see contraventions, they may issue improvement notices. Where they see immediate risks, they may issue prohibition notices, all the way through to investigators undertaking investigations for purposes of prosecution. So no, it's not there to replace or reduce any other compliance tools available to an inspector.
Yeah, great. So, Rob, just staying with you, we've mentioned this 31st of July kickoff quite a few times, but can the infringement notice scheme or a notice be applied retrospectively?
No, they can't be applied retrospectively. Basically, what will happen is come 31st of July, if an inspector's on site and they see an offence that's an infringible offence, they have the ability to issue an infringement notice only from that day forward.
Yeah, okay, excellent. So, Nat, I just want to come back to you and recap. What I'm hearing is if you're following your health and safety duties now, you're complying with those, you really don't need to change anything from the 31st of July. Is that right?
That's right, Kate. So infringement notices just add to the suite of tools that an inspector can use. But I guess it's also a good reminder that there's no complacency in workplace safety. So an employer or a duty holder should always be thinking of the risks that their undertaking or their business can pose to both employees and other persons, and be thinking of ways to eliminate or reduce those risks.
Excellent. So I just want to recap on today's key messages. What I've heard is that health and safety regulations will be amended to prescribe certain offences when an infringement notice can be issued by an inspector. So this amendment will also specify particular penalties for these offences, and it gives Worksafe inspectors the power to issue an infringement notice as an alternative to prosecution. And you've just heard about how that will be issued. These changes will come into effect next week from the 31st of July. So I'm going to come to the panel members now for one final message. Natalie, I will start with you.
Sure. So this has been said a lot, but I think it's just really important to keep reiterating. Infringement notices are just an additional compliance and enforcement tool. They don't amend any obligations that are currently in existence. So as a duty holder, if you're doing the right thing, now. You don't have anything to worry about. You don't need to change anything. You just keep doing what you're doing, and infringement notices won't even apply to you.
Yeah, that's great. And Rob?
Thank you. Employers and duty holders should continually think about the risks to their employees and consider the steps that you need to take to either eliminate those risks or mitigate against them to provide a safe workplace and ensure your employees are healthy and safe.
Yeah, that's excellent, guys. Thank you, Rob and Nat. This is where we're going to say goodbye to you both.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Kate.
So further to what you have heard today, we are working to ensure that businesses and the Victorian community are well prepared and informed about the new infringement scheme, what it means for them, and where you can go to get more information. Our website, if you hadn't figured out already, is the central point of information. I encourage you to go find information there. You can also call advisory though if you need some specific guidance. There are lots of pieces of guidance and tools specific to industries and workplaces around health and safety and reducing that risk in your workplace, as Rob indicated. And information will also be available specifically for employers to ensure they know what their obligations are and what they need to do in their workplace. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.